Hi, everyone. Good Sunday afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. I think we'll just wait a few minutes to let people kind of trickle in. My name's Keisha Knight, and I'm the founder and director of Sentient Art Film, and we're so thrilled to be releasing Truth or Consequences this weekend all across the country. Hopefully, many of you have seen it, and if you haven't, hopefully you will. And as part of our kind of opening weekend celebration, we wanted to really get together in conversation with Alexander Porter and Hannah Jayanti. Hannah is the director of the film, and Alexander is a co-creator of the virtual experience and kind of helped very intimately and in a kind of broad way create the experience of the film. So they'll be talking a lot about that today. And the moderator today is going to be Inney Prakash. And Inney has a special connection for us with this film because it's because of Inney that we were actually connected with Hannah and Sarah to start conversation around the best way to release and get this film out to a wider audience. So we're so happy that you can all be here today. And Inney and Hannah and Alexander, if you'd like to turn on your video, we can officially get started. My preamble is over, a little bumbling, but there you go. But so I'll just start by introducing Inney. And Inney Prakash is a film curator based in New York City. He's a member of the cooperative cinema programming team at Maisels Documentary Center in Harlem, an associate programmer at Aspen Shorts Fest, and founder-director of Prismatic Ground, a new film festival centered on experimental documentary that will be hosted virtually for its first year, this year, from April 8th to 18th. And we'll be putting out more information about that, but you can find more info on that at prismaticground.com. And without further ado, I'll pass it to you, Inney. I would just say for our participants, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A and also in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. So once we open up into the Q&A space, we can kind of address the questions that arise. Inney, all yours.
Thank you, Keisha. Thanks everyone for being here, especially Hannah and Alexander. As Keisha mentioned, so I had connected you two. It just seemed to make perfect sense when we showed this film, Truth or Consequences, as part of a series called After Civilization at Maisels Documentary Center last summer. It was still on the festival circuit then, but I saw this film and I loved it so much. I had a series of really incredible conversations with Hannah and the film's producer, Sarah, and sort of pressured them into letting us show it a bit early. I'm so glad it's being released now and to be here. So I'll go ahead and do some introductions. Hannah Jayanti is a documentary filmmaker, organizer, and educator. She directs, produces, shoots, edits, and does sound. She's dedicated to changing the way we listen to each other through the art of nonfiction. Her work is screened at festivals and institutions, including the Smithsonian, Rotterdam, Sheffield, Doc Leipzig, the New Yorker Festival, Union Docs, Camden International Film Festival, Tribeca Film Festival Storyscapes, among others. Her work has been supported by Sundance Institute, Sundance Edit and Story Lab, Tribeca Film Institute, New York Council on the Arts, New York Foundation for the Arts, the Jerome Foundation, the Knight Foundation, and others. Her organizing work includes co-creating spaces that model anti-capitalist practices while creating surprising futures, including Meteoric, a free and public arts and film festival in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, which we'll definitely talk about, and IDD, a non-hierarchical and growing group of independent documentary directors. Her work as an educator is focused on free and low-cost media training and literacy through community media centers and public access stations. And you can find more information about her work at hannahjayanti.com. Alexander Porter is an immersive director, digital artist, and educator. He's a co-founder of Scatter, an Emmy Award-winning immersive storytelling and software company. Scatter is recognized for defining the discipline of volumetric filmmaking through immersive productions and creating virtual and augmented reality creativity tools. Scatter's first product, Depth Kit, is the first and most widely used software for volumetric video production. Alexander creates transmedia documentary projects with his partner, Hannah Jayanti. The most recent is the feature Truth or Consequences, a speculative documentary film about the world's first spaceport and the town nearby. The project comprises a feature film, a local film festival, and bespoke virtual cinematography tool designed to virtually film 3D reconstructions called from video footage and brought to life in virtual reality. If you've seen the film, you know that it contains some really engaging virtual reality worlds, and Alexander is responsible for designing those. Thank you, Alexander and Hannah, so much for being here.
Thank you, Inney.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. It's always so strange to hear oneself described. I really appreciate you introducing us.
Of course, yeah, it's an honor. And you know, we spoke a little bit beforehand about what we might cover, and I know that you have a really holistic and comprehensive approach when it comes to your ethics and the politics of your filmmaking. You mentioned to me that you had a friend who spoke about the politics, not just of the content in a film, but of the form as well, and of the process, which you've spoken to me really thoroughly and grippingly about. So I wonder if we could start there and you could talk about that sort of trifecta of how you create art.
I love that prompt. Thank you. So this is, I cannot attribute this thinking to us. This is something that I think, first of all, I think a lot of people are thinking about, which is great. But a friend of mine, Samara Grace Chadwick, I was talking to her about some of these ideas, and she said that she had recently heard a phrasing around political films, that they can be political in 3 ways. And I'm paraphrasing this, but they can be political based on content, they can be political based on form, and they can be political based on process. And what it made me realize is that conventionally, when we talk about a political form, we're almost always talking about the first. We're talking about a film that deals with political subjects, where the content is around activism or around political ideas. And it made me realize that number 2 and 3, form and process, there are many, many people working in this way and celebrating projects like this, but it is a quieter conversation. And I think, form as political is a conversation that quite a lot really incredible programmers like yourself, Inney, distributors like Sentient Art, festivals like Sheffield are really thinking about. And then it strikes me, and I could be wrong, but it strikes me that number 3 is the one that's sort of the quietest of the conversations, which is how the integrity process and the way that a project gets made, how that is also a political and ethical act. And one of the things that we're really committed to is talking about that and really thinking it through and thinking about different ways of making films, both with the people that we film with, but also with our team members.
I have an example,
Please.
if that helps. An example of that is that in setting out to create the film, we had a set of principles in mind more than a kind of fixed outcome for what the film was intended to be. And so an example of that is that we had a commitment to the idea that everyone who contributes to the film, whether on the creation of it or participating on the screen, that they get something for themselves in their life or livelihood or what their goals are, something fulfilled for themselves out of the process of participating in the film. So that the idea is that the film gives to people based on their participation. And as a result of that, we had conversations at the outset of every single collaboration that were asking about what that was for people. What were they seeking in their lives? What were they looking for in their creative process or their lives or lifestyles? And it meant that the film then needed to be responsible to fulfilling on that. And it creates a film that ends up being kind of a journey where we are as surprised in some moments as any of you might have been who saw it about where it landed. And it creates a process of exploration that's a little bit unconventional from the perspective of conventional documentary or filmmaking, where it's all about an individual director having a particular vision, and then the entire process of fundraising, film creation, et cetera, is about just the realization precisely of what that vision is. So for us, that vision was actually about creating principles to live by or work by.
That's really great. As a curator, it can be easy for me, I think, and my colleagues sometimes to overlook the production process because we're not a part of it. So I'm so happy that you're interested in foregrounding it. And I actually have, Hannah, you sent me the list of principles that you used. Would it be okay with you if I went ahead and read those out?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, so you had listening, integrity of process as part of the ethics of documentary filmmaking broadly, using the camera as a way of shifting where we place value, specifically away from exceptionalism and towards finding meaning and value in the parts of lives that are rarely considered worthy of being captured on film, shifting the conversation around how documentaries relate to the people and places they represent, co-creation, and formal risk-taking work as ethical and political. So the film is referred to by you as a speculative documentary. It uses documentary footage, but a sci-fi framing device to suggest that the town that we're seeing, which is one of the poorest in the country, actually represents the people left behind by space travel. In the world we're seeing, commercial space travel has happened, and the people who can afford it, of course, are the wealthiest of citizens. So with that in mind, with those principles in mind, how did you come to that framing device?
It's a great question. It's also, it's wonderful to hear these principles because it makes me realize that we have these really like lofty ideas, and it's probably worth mentioning that we falter a lot through them. We sort of, we hit and miss, and we mess up, and but that it is a really interesting way to work, where you are just constantly asking yourself, am I listening? It's like, I guess that's what we are trying to sort of do in our work, is instead of saying, is this film, there's this phrase, is the film working? This phrase that everyone says, which I've just never understood, by the way, but we try to ask questions that are like, are we listening? And it just creates a really different framework. And again, there's lots of times when, I will act like an ego director and not listen, and then try to come back to the question of am I listening? So to your question, Inney, about the speculative premise, the speculative premise was very much born out of trying to ask those kinds of questions. And the way that it came about, I mean, it's a little bit of like a process story, but it came about because, so I have filmed in the town for about 3 years, like sort of 5 months or about 3 years. And I had filmed in an intentionally really like intuitive way. And I've been trying to develop this practice when I film, which is to to really just not know what I'm going to go find, which is traditionally, I think, something you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to be super clear about what you want to get and how you want to get it. And so I've been trying to work in a way where I don't know. And that's not to say that I have no idea what's going on. Like, I am like connected to the place and connected to the people, but I have this experience that if I have a really clear set in my brain of what I want to find, I find it very hard to listen to people. I'm always trying to like see if I'm always comparing it against what I want to find. So I'm always like, oh, did they tell me that? Did that, So the filming is a lot around kind of trying to put that part of quiet that part of my brain so I can really be with people. And so the footage when you film that way, the footage that you gather, especially like a lot of the ways that I film, is that I would just ask people what they were doing. So I'd literally just be calling people in town and being like, what do you think I should film? What are you doing? And then the things that resonated with me, that would be what I would go and follow, and I didn't always know why. And so when you film that way, you are not filming for storycraft. You are not filming for an unfolding of an event. You are not filming around the kind of ideas that we traditionally think about for documentary filmmaking, like the story of the spaceport. How is the spaceport going to affect the town? You're filming about what sort of opens up to you while you're there, and who chooses to share with you and what they choose to share with you. And so we had this, when we went into the edit, we had this experience of trying to like do a good job of making a documentary film, which one of the other thing that we've realized is doing a good job of making a documentary film is often about storycraft. It's often about like taking all this footage that you've made and crafting it into a narrative that makes sense, right? A narrative that's like beginning, middle, end, character arcs, story trajectories, resolutions, like causality, like this happened because of this, or like all, the biggest one was, let's make the film so that everybody's lives are related to the spaceport. That would have been doing a good documentary, right?
That was like the good advice that we got.
Yeah. Each of the people in the film becomes an example of the spaceport's effect on the town,
or the human relationship to progress and technology or whatever.
Yeah. And so we made a cut of that film, so we're trying to do a good job. And we showed it at a lab at the Rough Cut retreat. And I personally was just like super humbled and actually pretty distraught to discover that I had edited a film that was really like the opposite of the intention of how I had filmed and how I had gone about it. And it was a really challenging moment. I mean, I felt like I had almost, this sounds very drastic, but I felt like I'd almost done a kind of a violence to the footage by squeezing it, just like squeezing and distilling and narrativizing. And it was, I don't know, we had to realize that was, I guess just not the film that we wanted to make.
Yeah.
And so we started thinking about, well,
something like that.
Sure.
The funny thing is it was, and this was like 2 years into the process, and it was a perfectly good film, and it was quite straightforward. And in many ways, I think it's kind of the type of film that someone would expect when they would see the subject matter, a relatively impoverished town on the surface, right, in the shadow of this sort of like temple of hubris, the sort of the spaceport. But there was no way to craft it, especially with the background of the name of the towns. The name of the town named themselves after a game show, and it's like there's this sort of, it feels like there's this narrative of gambling that's in the town. It's like a gamble on big futures, and almost nothing we could do made it so that it didn't feel like it was like the question in the background for everything was, the town gambled again. Is it going to work this time, right? And then the audience is in this special position of sort of going, probably not, or it didn't work last time or whatever. And so the audience is in this sort of seemingly this elevated position of knowing what the future is going to be for these people when they don't seem to know it for themselves.
Yeah.
And that, again, it was like a perfectly beautiful film and well made and well put together. But we had this moment of seeing our own project, seeing the film on screen and going, that's not it. It's not right.
I think we also started feeling like there are quite a lot of power structures that get built in a lot of this stuff. Like the more focus that we put on the spaceport, the more power it has.
Yeah.
The more that we frame the people's lives based on the spaceport, the more power it has. And like it doesn't need more power. It's like Virgin Galactic and Elon Musk and like a ton of tax money. That's not that might be like the cool story, but that's just like, we don't need to be contributing another story about like a small rural town and like I don't know,
it's lucky attitude.
Yeah, it just felt and Inney, this is finally coming back to your question. Imagine the conversation. Imagine if this is how circumvent we talk about things. Imagine the conversations between us. We recut the whole film in like 3 months.
From first person, from original footage.
Yeah. And I was working with Mary Lampson, who's this incredible editor, and she was amazing. And she said, go back and rewatch all the original footage. And nobody really does this when they're making a project, especially so late in. And I just watched all of it, like uncut footage. And it made me realize how much I had missed in the beginning when I was trying to do a good job, when I was trying to cram stuff into this more conventional narrative. And the basic idea for the speculative premise was like, what if we just took that mechanism out, that mechanism of here is this outside influence that may or may not save the town. What if we took it out? What would happen? What if we borrowed from speculative science fiction and just said this nascent technology has already happened? What would happen? And what ended up happening was the questions changed. So instead of it being about the spaceport, it started being about the people. Who are they? What do they care about? What are they saying their lives mean? What are they showing us?
What are the futures that they're building for themselves?
Yeah. And so, and it basically allowed for like an emergent structure to come out based on the footage rather than based on some crazy idea we had about. And so it's just ironic because I think a lot of people read the speculative premise and think that it's something that we imposed on it. You know, like we had a quirky idea and we imposed on it. And actually our process was the exact opposite. It was the only way that we felt like we could get back to the foundations of what we understood the footage to be and what we understood documentary filmmaking to be about.
That's extraordinary, and that makes so much sense because it doesn't feel like a gimmick. It feels organic to what you're trying to say and what I think you accomplished saying. So I think you really succeeded in that way. And for those who might be unclear, we should mention too, the spaceport is a real thing. It's somewhere between a novelty and a gamble, as you mentioned, Alexander. But you know, of course, it's not operating. But the framing you put around it, this idea that it has been an operation, and these are the people who are left behind, really does allow their struggles to take kind of center. Something you had mentioned to me, you know, we've talked a lot about extraction and the different levels of extractive processes, was how you dislike the way people talk about gaining subjects' trust in documentary. Like it's almost something transactional. You know, you have to sort of seduce subjects into getting them to trust you or spend a lot of time with them. And you know, you talked about having a genuine interaction with somebody, even if it's only a brief one. The three characters that you focus on the film are all extraordinarily rich and share really intimate details about their lives. I was wondering if you could talk about your process of getting to know them and interviewing them.
Yeah, I'll also say one thing, which is that we like to think about the film as the people who stayed rather than the people who were left behind.
Yeah, it's like people who elected to stay.
That they choose because they actually know what's up.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
So I feel, I mean, so a lot of my ethics come from just a personal experience I have in the world. So I find that whenever I want something from somebody else, I just turn into a weirdo. Like I just, because, you know, like it's all, you know, I'm sort of thinking, I'm sort of half listening, you know, I'm like, oh, that's nice, but please tell me about this thing, you know what I mean? And sort of always trying to kind of get them over to what I want. And I find this like in life in general, you know, when you're talking to somebody. And I think a big realization for me is that actually gets in the way of like being with the person. It actually really gets in the way of just like being with what they're saying, which by the way, I think is a life practice. Like, I'm not even sure we can ever do that, but I think that it is a practice. And sometimes I think that my filmmaking is a practice in doing that. Because I have found that it's incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard to just like be with somebody and try to understand the texture of their life and try to not keep making it whatever you think it should be or whatever you want it to be. And I personally find that the camera is the best way that I've found to practice that. It allows, there's something about looking through your camera with somebody that is like a tremendous space of love and curiosity. It's like a tremendous space of giving someone else the benefit of the doubt, you know, where they can kind of sort of step into who they want to show you. And so when that happens, it's remarkable because you'd have to talk to the people in the film, you know, or anyone else I filmed with, but my experience is that it can be quite a beautiful moment, and that it can actually transcend a moment of like getting something, not getting something, which is why I just really struggle with the terminology in documentary around like, oh, did you get it? You know, or like looking at your footage and being like, oh, I didn't get what I wanted. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like you got what you got, you know, like it's, I don't know, there's just could be really different language around it. So I also feel that there's a way of speaking to people. If you can sort of do that kind of practice, there's a way of speaking to people where that is a little bit closer to oral history, I guess, even though I'm not an oral historian, I don't actually know exactly what it is, but my understanding of it is that it's an open-ended process where somebody guides you. And so somebody will say something and you'll be like, oh, I can sense that there's some emotion there, or there's some meaning there. So then you ask a question about that. And then they take you over here, and you kind of end up wherever they want to take you, which is usually what they care about. It's usually what's on their mind, usually what matters to them. And if you can just follow that with them and hold a space for that, everyone has the experience of trust. I guess that's what I would say. That's trust. And then just other simple things, like I'll always ask people. I'll be like, "How did that go?" There's one really challenging scene in the film with Yvonne where she talks about sexual violence that she had when she was younger, and I showed those scenes to her, and we talked it through. And so I think there's also that, like, we think there's something where we think we can't talk to people like normal people. You just ask people, is this working for you? Do you want to share that? Did you like that? Did you feel comfortable? Do you not? You know what I mean? Like, we could, if we treated everybody like a collaborator and that we could just talk to them, I think that there would be a lot more trust.
One thing I'll add is this question. So the quality of the conversations with the people in the film, I think, are really exceptional. And we, in our lives with people who are close to us, we have rich conversations like that all day long, right? With family, with friends, etc. Conversations are rich when they're intimate. And there's something interesting or kind of odd when people will ask, go, how did you find these people? And where the subtext is these unusual, interesting, compelling, quirky people, or whatever that is. And I think my immediate response to that is actually like, if you give it the time, and if you're willing to devote the energy to giving the space for a conversation like that, everyone's that interesting, everyone's that compelling. It's just harder work, right? It's actually, if you don't have your structure in place ahead of time, and then you get people to fill in your structure, it's just a lot more work to deal with that narrative. So,
and I think the simple question about the people in the film, where they were the people who I loved. They were the people who I wanted to spend the most time with,
Yeah, and they're Yvonne, Katie, and George, right? They're all extraordinarily self-possessed and interesting people. So thank you for correcting me. They're very much the people who stayed. There's nothing seeming left behind about them. One question in the chat is, you talked about approaching the film without imposing this overarching structure or story on it. And so someone wants to know what drew you to the place, since that was the case.
Very simply, I did an arts residency. It's called Starry Night Residency. It's still there. It's wonderful. It's run by a wonderful woman named Kate now. And this film for me, this is my third film. And I felt like I had never fully sort of risked discovering what I make. Turns out that I make slightly unusual things. I didn't know that. But I felt this just existential, just urgency to figure out what I make. And I went to college in New Mexico, and I spent some time working and living off grid up north. And I love it. It's the place, it feels like a weird ancient home for me somehow. I've never quite understood it. And so I was just like, I'll go there. I'll go back there and I'll try this thing. I hadn't really shot before. And so it was quite scary, by the way. Going out to a place that you don't know anyone and going out and filming every day, it's really confronting. And yeah, and then I think
you hadn't shot before, as in you weren't familiar with the camera, or you hadn't shot there before?
I hadn't shot for a film before. Like, it was the first time that I'd shot a project.
Okay, wow, sorry, I just had to clarify because that's deeply impressive.
Thank you. I filmed on a Mark II, Canon Mark II, which if anyone knows this camera, it shuts off every 12 minutes. And you have to, like, there's no audio inputs. So you have to, like, I had to have a separate audio thing. It was just, and it was really hot. So parts of my camera kept melting. But it was I learned a lot very quickly. But I was,
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So we're partners. So we have
yeah, there's nothing untoward happening here. If you notice any blushing or touching.
Yes, we're in a pod. So before Hannah went out to this residency, she was obsessed with death.
oh God.
She was like, and really just mad all the time for like a while in advance. And I think it was this sense, and the reason I share this is like, we all have this experience, I think. And I think it's wonderful to celebrate moments when we overcome that and actually step into whatever that project is for ourselves. So Hannah was really obsessed with this idea that she might die before making that thing she wanted to make. So she made prior work, but then she just had this existential intensity, thinking, oh no, what if I get hit by a bus and I haven't made something that I'm really, really proud of, or that feels like a true manifestation of the kinds of work I want to make.
Not something really proud of, I think just something that where I really just totally
believe in it.
Just totally followed it. I think, and it's funny, I find this a little embarrassing, but it is true that I was worried about getting hit by a car and thinking that you didn't do the thing. And that was weirdly very motivating to me for a little while.
I think everyone can relate.
Yeah, especially now if we're not all more aware of our mortality. I don't know what would cause that. Hopefully we all, go out and create that thing like you did. I want to make sure I ask you, Alexander, about the virtual reality world in the film, because it's super evocative. And yeah, just how did that come about? You mentioned you're romantic as well as professional partners. So at what point did you become involved in the process? And, in what ways does that sort of graphic evocation speak to the film's themes and intention for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are kind of collaborators in all things, and it's a very particular choice. Not everyone chooses to work this way. And in my work, I have a small company called Scatter, and we build creative tools and we make virtual reality experiences. And I have a background in photography, film, cinematography, and that kind of thing. And so, I spent time with Hannah in True Consequences doing some filming, and then I have just a kind of natural creative practice, which is 3D scanning things. And the technique that I use is called photogrammetry. And what I find interesting about it is it's a technique that uses photographs or imagery as the input to reconstruct three-dimensional shapes of the world. And it's conventionally used in kind of arts preservation or kind of cultural preservation, archaeology, to preserve the things that are the most important for culture or deemed to be most important for culture. And something I find interesting is to use that tool or use those tools to focus on the everyday experience. In the trajectory of film, it kind of went through a similar path, right? It's sort of like, it's expensive, it's hard, it's complicated, it's technological or whatever. So we try to apply it to the things that seem most salient and valuable. But then when it gets really rich is when you turn it on real life. And so that's just a practice for me in daily life. And so I'm there in town with Hannah and we're filming. And I'm doing this, I'm just kind of doing this sort of scanning. And I was sensitive to not wanting to intervene or get too involved in the project, just to leave space for what Hannah was kind of describing. But around the time of this moment that we described, where we had sort of like created this film, it was not quite what we were trying to create. That was when I sort of really perked up, because the like sort of speculative practices and sort of science fiction and supernatural and surreal experiences is I just love that kind of world where you're not necessarily beholden to exactly the way everything is. And so at that time, I would say that was when I got more deeply involved as a day-to-day collaborator and contributor on the project. And around that time, that's when we started to add in the archival footage. Initially, there was essentially no archival, and when we started to explore with the scans that I had kind of incidentally created in town. So that is kind of when my contribution kind of entered, and then I was watching obviously I was watching the cut all the time.
But there was a real breakthrough weekend.
Yeah, so at that time, we sort of had this crisis, and I used a bunch of kind of techniques that I use in my work around design practices, and kind of we went through a series of kind of explorations, and I was sort of like, I felt like almost a creative sort of consultant, and then it just exploded and we made this entire kind of additional project. And so for me, I'm sort of circumventing your question a little bit, because for me, it's all one, it's kind of part and parcel. The archival material, the kind of premise, the structure, all of it, that's what we started to kind of evolve. And in doing so, we're doing all of these, we're sort of like, the conventional tools had kind of failed us for filmmaking, where people would be like, just narrow it down and just make it simple and make a story and all of that had just completely folded on us and wasn't working. And so we had to kind of draw from other places. And in doing so, we were doing all of this thinking about who these characters were and simple and core ideas. Like, for example, for me, one of the core ideas that we discovered around that time was this idea that I learned in a past life. I worked as an archaeological photographer, and there's this experience when in archaeology, when an archaeologist picks up an object with their body of understanding, it's a transcendent experience, because they see an entire narrative. They see a civilization rise and fall. They see all of this power just around this sort of singular object.
It's like a transmission.
It's like a sort of transmission from the past. And so if you have access to that, that's kind of what happens, that evocation. And so around that time, we came up with this notion that George was playing this sort of that role in town by kind of the sort of shepherding and the sort of husbandry, caring for all these objects and understanding their context. And we sort of realized at that time that we had a kind of kinship with George and the work that he was doing, where we had kind of gathered all these reconstructions, these artifacts, this footage from the town, and we were trying to sort out what it actually means. And we started to get strange at that time and started to imagine, what is that? Because that's time travel, right? When you pick up an object, and you have that context, you're traveling in time. And that was this sort of gateway into this, what happened with the film. And in doing so, we started to realize, like, what is that space? What does that look like? What does it feel like when you sort of grab something and it summons this whole universe? Like, what is that? What should that look like? And around that time is when we went to this material that I had created initially in town. This is a long story because it's a long story. So we discovered, I had done all this conventional photogrammetry. We flew in an airplane. We kind of walked around, and I took all these scans. We ended up not using any of that material, but we used the technique. What we did was we took the footage, the kind of extra footage, the B-roll, or the kind of in-between moments.
One way of thinking about it is like let's say I'm filming with Yvonne in the trailer. I'm just adding, we're collaborating right now. If I'm filming with somebody and like I go from, like, I'm in their trailer and I go from here to here, in that space, I've also recorded their space.
Yeah.
And it's like the throwaway footage, right? Like you would never use it. And so we started thinking, what if we use some of that sort of seemingly throwaway spatial footage
to reconstruct it? So we had this seminal moment when it sort of came together, where I kind of come up with this idea to use the footage instead of the photographs to reconstruct these spaces. And initially it was just like, what would that feel like? And we were at a residency, or Hannah was at a residency at the Jacob Burns Center upstate. And I did this reconstruction, and we built initially Yvonne's trailer, which is the conclusion of the film. And again, I'm taking these little snippets of footage, exporting it as a series of of image frames and then kind of jamming it through this process that wasn't designed to take this material, which is what causes the kind of artifacting and the surreality of it. And so we reconstructed this scene, and then we put on a VR headset and started to just walk through that space. And immediately we both had this incredibly intense and emotional and moving experience of revisiting this sort of imperfect visitation of material that is from the past. And I think we each had our own experience of that, but we knew that suddenly we were having personally an experience that was this same archaeological experience of revisiting something and having this profound experience with it, except just with our own footage. So that is when we started to create these worlds. And for anyone who hasn't seen the film, there are these kind of pointillist, almost dusty spaces that are a kind of sparse reconstruction of what these scenes are like. And we've built kind of like almost like a little, we've constructed them into a little landscape that approximates the shape of the town. And then we filmed in there in virtual reality by physically moving as if we're filming. So there's a kind of naturalistic movement. And then that becomes, we exported that basically as footage that could get edited into the film.
So one thing that's interesting sorry, Inney, you go, because we're just talking.
Oh, no worries. I just wanted to make sure there are a couple things I want to hit on as well, including the score by Bill Frisell, which is incredibly like piquant and curious and soul stirring. And I'm just wondering about your collaboration process with him.
So kind of similarly to I think about it a little bit similar to the virtual reality worlds, which is working in a way that is built around someone's artistic process and where we don't totally know the outcome. And that's challenging in the world of documentary, which is a lot around control, actually, if we really think about it. It's a lot around making meaning from a world that is chaotic. And being able to control it, which really I can understand that feeling, like wanting that. So with Bill, he just improvised to the footage. So I think my favorite thing was that I had cut some scenes to his music and then showed him a cut, and then he came onto the project about 1.5 years before we finished, and we did our first recording session where I just made really loose edits. So I made loose edits of all the shots that were heat or wind or all the shots of George, and they were maybe like 5 or 10 minutes long, and Bill would just play, and he would just play and play and play until he didn't want to play anymore. And so we have these like absolutely incredible tracks, something from, some of them are 4 minutes, some of them are 17 minutes, of just a journey of somebody just responding immediately to the footage. And I think it was, we've talked to Bill about it, but I think it sounds like it was quite special for him as well, because I'm not, I think that way of working that's really open-ended is really like, that's a space that I understand that he likes to live in. And then I would go cut to the footage, and then we'd do another recording session, and then he would play to slightly, he would play over to himself to other scenes. So yeah, I loved it as a practice of like giving parts away, of a practice of like the things growing together. Because I don't know if people know, but very often scores are made at the end when it's totally finished, and they're just made to the cut. So this felt like a way that it was kind of growing together.
It was an example. We talked about this principle of kind of asking people, what do you want more of in your life? Like, what are you trying to create? And it was, so I've known Bill and his family for a very long time. And so if you don't know his work before, I know you do. He's this absolute master improviser, right? He's a jazz guitarist, and an extraordinary one. And his whole thing is improvisation and live performance. But then we asked him this question, like, what would you like more of? And his answer was improvisation, right?
Just to wild out.
Just to wild out, just to get the time and just allow it to play and go and go and go, which is really surprising. It goes to show you just don't know what it is for people. And so what we did was, just to sort of paint a picture, is we, in Figure 8 Studios here in Brooklyn, which is, studios are relatively small, but we set up as big a screen as we possibly could. It's floor to ceiling, just filled up the studio and then projected onto the screen. and they just put him on a stool in front of this gigantic screen. And so he's just like in the world. And the work he produced was just breathtaking, just totally extraordinary. Like we listened to
all the time.
we listen to it all the time because there's just so much and it's all magnificent.
Your generosity of really caring what others want to get out of the process, that extended beyond the film as well. I sort of mentioned in your bio, Hannah, but you created this arts festival called Meteoric, along with inhabitants of the town of Truth or Consequences. Can you talk about why and how that came about as well?
Yeah, so very much a co-creation. There were a lot of people involved, but for a while the core was Alexander and me and Melissa McKinstry and Truth or Consequences and Kyle Parker Cunningham and Jeannie Ortiz. And there were a lot of others. I just want to be clear, this was like a really sort of horizontal, messy, beautiful collaboration.
Yeah, Sarah and Jonathan.
Yes, many people. But when we had this kind of crisis of faith, I don't know what to call it, during the making of the film, which, by the way, just for anyone who's listening that has a creative process, those times are hard. And it's just interesting because I think a lot of times when we reach those hard points, we think something's wrong. And I've started trying to think, oh, well, maybe that actually is a wonderful time of growth. And the hardness of it maybe doesn't mean something's bad. But we started thinking, where haven't we been listening? You know, if we were able to sort of make this much more conventional narrative, doing a bit of violence to the footage, have we been doing that in other places? Like, where haven't we been listening? You know, we can talk all we want about our great intentions, but have we been actually doing it? And we started thinking, you know what, we haven't done it in relationship to the town. We are still acting in this really, really common extractive way where somebody who doesn't live in a town goes to a town, films, right, extracts the footage, and then goes make their career on it.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they were sort of coveting and fretting over this footage, but not actually an active, I mean, you know, in regular dialogue, but this fundamental idea that everyone who's contributing to the project is actually getting a future fulfilled for themselves, something big and beautiful that they didn't have before. That wasn't necessarily true for the people who were in town. And so I think that was a moment where we started thinking, well, if we're going to be able to say anything about this project, like if we're going to make any of the claims that we hope it's about, we have to try listening to the people in the town and the people in the film. So we started similarly just having conversations with people in the film and people in the town, and just about what the film could do or what they wanted. Really open-ended, very long, open-ended, many conversations. And we realized there were sort of two things that were happening in our artistic community, because we were also having it with a bunch of our friends outside of Truth or Consequences. People were feeling like they had opportunities, you know what I mean? Like they could make money, but they weren't able to totally follow their self-expression. You know, they weren't able to be totally risk-taking. So they were like, well, I got to do sustainability. I got to make money, so I can't do my weird art. And then people in Truth or Consequences are like, I'm making my weird art, but I can't make any money. You know, and we were like, this is like, what if there could be both? Like, what if people outside of town could come into town and just have like a wild expressive weekend where they just make whatever they want? And what if we could actually create sustainability in the town through doing that? And so we just created this free and public arts film festival where the prompt was, what would you make if you could make something in a really unconstrained way? And then we'll find a place for it. And so our role is just to try to find, you know, venues in the place where people could make whatever they want. And it was really beautiful. And I think that one of the most amazing things was people just really ran with it. People just started making their own stuff, and it just became a space, like an invitation more than anything else. And our biggest attempt was like to make it a space so that if people wanted to get involved, if they wanted to do something, if they wanted to do a performance, whatever, that we could help make that happen. And it was just it was like extraordinary. It was breathtaking. There are so many anecdotes from this experience where, so we sort of like had these conversations with these two different communities and tried to bring them together. And so on the one hand, we had these extraordinary artists from our community, like Lauren McCarthy, Sam Levine, who made these kind of custom, these bespoke interactive installations and all of this amazing work. And then the town just absolutely lit up and completely exploded. And it was this amazing journey where, like, when you're doing something that's just bubbling over like that, there's the idea of like being in any semblance of control over the process is just absurd. And so any person who arrives willing to work and contribute is now in charge of whatever it is that they're good at. And so that process just evolved all over town to the point where we showed up about a week in advance, and it had taken on a life of its own. And so when it actually occurred, and we brought about 20 people from all over this, kind of all over North America, mostly, and Canada, yeah. And then it had just completely erupted. And so there was this map of the events in town, and it was just so many things that we had never heard of that were just had completely evolved. And so when the actual event occurred, there were just like installations, and there were just like people playing banjo on the street, and like nice. It's just like everyone just drove from the region there, and we were showing films. We showed in the Spaceport Visitor Center, which is that environment with all of the shot glasses and that kind of weird desk, and it's in the film. We rolled that weird space desk out of the way, and we showed films in that space. And it was just completely extraordinary. And then we screened the film there under the moonlight to the town, to the people in the film.
I got to sit next to George and Olin and Katie while they watched the film, and it was really special.
That's so magical. Yeah, I wish I could have been there. How did they react?
They loved it.
Everyone had their own reaction.
But they loved it. I remember one of my favorite ones was George leaned over to me and said, "I have so many more marbles now." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." And then I think, Katie felt really seen.
Yeah. She felt really cool.
Yeah, she was like, "I look so cool."
Made me happy.
And then Olin Olin said this beautiful thing, and this is paraphrasing, but something along the lines like, "If you had made a more traditional film about this town, you would have completely missed the point." And that, I think, was really, meaningful.
It was nerve-wracking in the sense that we had made a really unusual thing that was partly built out of their lives and the things that they had shared. And there is a presupposition about what a documentary is, and it wasn't that. And we brought it back to them. And I don't know about you, but I was nervous-sided about that experience. And what was interesting was the impression I got was they were like, they loved it, and they were like, honestly, you could have gone a little farther. Like that was the general theme, which is always good feedback.
I love that. Especially if you would have made a more traditional film, you would have missed the point. It sounds like you really keyed in early to the spirit of the town, and they saw that. We had a question in the chat. Someone was curious. You mentioned having to, feeling you needed to revisit all the footage at the behest of your editor. Someone asked how much footage you had, and I was wondering a little more about that process of revisiting all that footage without intention and then creating something from that.
I love that question. So I think it's also a particular thing, like, because I directed, shot, and edited the film, there's also like, you're constantly navigating your own relationship to the footage. But just specific, so I filmed about 150 hours. And this is a little technical, but I really like this for some reason, which is that, so I edit in Avid, and the usual way that you make a film is that you have like your daily, right? So like all day I shot with George at the dump, for example, and then I have all my footage, and it's like in a string out, just all the footage together.
So it's one timeline that represents the whole day.
Yeah. And then usually what you do is you make selects from it, right? Because you're working in this way, you have to start whittling it down, because you just have to start making shapes. because it's very overwhelming to sort of start. So you start like making selects. And then what happens is you start editing the film from those selects. And so what that means is you're editing the film based on choices that you made really early on. And you usually don't go back and edit from the actual footage. And so there's whole parts that you've had to cut out that you've decided aren't worthy of the film. And
they're often oblivion, probably never seen again.
Yeah. And that's usually how it happens. You just whittle, right? And so this was then I started cutting from the dailies, from the original footage, not from my selects. And this was a practice that Mary Lamson really encouraged me to do. And it means that you have to be with everything. You have to be with I had to be with all the mistakes I made with the camera. I had to be with all of the, sort of ridiculous things that I was saying to people, and I just had to be with the footage. And I'll just give one quick example, which is that one of the things that really struck me is that in almost all my footage when I'm hanging out with George, he's just showing me stuff. He's just like, here, look at this. Here, look at this. Hey, isn't the history of plastics crazy? Hey, look at this. You know what I mean? It just has this like I have this idea, by the way, that George is like the only sane one among us because he's the only one who's actually looking at what's happening. But for this sort of my first rough cut, I had cut all those moments out. And I had instead had really prioritized him trying to verbalize why he does this stuff. So I'd made cuts about him being like, well, you know what I mean? Trying to like articulate and like why he did this, as if once I knew why he did it, I would know him. And I had cut out all these other moments when he was actually showing me stuff. And so that was like, that was when I was like, oh wow, I was not listening when I made that edit. I was not listening, because if I actually listened, I would see that almost all my footage is George showing me stuff. And actually the film has to be around what he's telling us, which to me has always been around finding value in the overlooked, finding, what I've started to call treasures and capitalist ruins, so.
30 fishing rods fished up from the lake.
That's not in the film.
But yeah, I can tell there's certainly more than we see in the film. I think we're about out of time. I want to thank you both so much, Hannah and Alexander, for the richness of your thought and conversation, as well as the beauty of your film. And I want to make sure I shout out that you all created some virtual worlds for the film that can be seen on Art Sentient's website. I think I'll drop a link in the chat. And thank you, Keisha, for giving us space to have this conversation. I'm so grateful, and I'll go ahead and throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, Inney. Well, the virtual worlds are becoming. I just wanted to, I don't know, Alexander, if you want to say anything about that. One of the things that's been amazing about this process is that, I think I was mentioning it to you, Inney, at the beginning, is that we really, the distribution process has also been collaborative. So we've been creating kind of an extended interactive experience to go along with the release, so people can kind of walk through these worlds. We're not quite done yet, but maybe we want to drop a link in the chat in case anyone wants to watch this space. Hannah or Alexander, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm very excited about this, but as part of bringing the film out into the world, as you can tell, it's all about bubbling over beyond the screen. And we've made this beautiful kind of interactive scene that you can navigate on a computer. It is actually not the link that you shared, Inney. That is a sort of a placeholder. Yeah, there you go, exactly. And so please enjoy. Again, use a computer, but it's the world of the film, and we invite you in. Yeah.
Can I add one quick thing? Also, and we're going to be doing iterations of it. So the first one is Phillips Trailer Park, and there's going to be more to come. I also just want to add one quick thing, which is that this kind of work, the kind of work that we've been doing that is like process oriented and is sort of explorative. Inney and Keisha are real sort of stewards and champions of this work and are dedicating so much of their time to supporting work that would not, necessarily be seen, and really making sure that the kind of important conversations around this are happening as curator, as programmer, as distributor, as film appreciators. And so I just want to send a huge thank you and acknowledgement to you two. For us, we've always felt like the project of the film is around finding our people and finding people to have these conversations with. And we are just honored to be in community and conversation with you both.
Thank you so much. I feel the same. We couldn't do this without you, obviously. Like, it's a huge team effort. So thank you so much. And thank you, Inney. And this has been a great conversation. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And check out the world, check out the films. Email us if you have any questions. I think that's it. Okay. Ciao.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.